Tonight, we descend into the shadows of history to uncover a secret the Vatican has fought to keep hidden for centuries. Beneath the ruins of ancient Babylon, excavations unearthed tunnels, tablets, and artifacts that were never meant to see the light of day. These relics speak of civilizations that understood the cosmos, mastered hidden technologies, and accessed knowledge without priests or scripture. But what was discovered beneath the sands threatened more than archaeology. It threatened authority, doctrine, and the story of human origins itself. The Vatican did not merely catalogue these findings. They locked them away, diverted entire crates of artifacts, and erased records, leaving only whispers for those brave enough to notice. Scholars who tried to follow the trail were silenced, discredited, or disappeared into obscurity. And now, we take you through the hidden corridors, forbidden texts, and forgotten technologies that may rewrite what we thought we knew about the cradle of civilization. Prepare to question everything, because the past you were taught may not be what actually happened. Before we journey further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. There are places in the world that seem to sleep beneath the sand, waiting for the right moment to breathe again. Babylon is one of them. The name alone carries the weight of myths and curses, a city that defied heaven and paid the price. But what if the story we've been told is not the full one? What if, beneath those broken bricks and sun-scorched stones, lies something far more unsettling, something that has drawn the eyes of the Vatican itself, not to bless, but to bury once more? In the year 2013, a quiet convoy crossed the desert at dawn. No reporters, no flags, no announcement of discovery. Just trucks bearing the insignia of cultural preservation, accompanied by men who carried more rifles than trowels. Their destination was the heart of ancient Babylon. Officially, it was an archaeological partnership between Rome and Baghdad. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. The locals spoke of lights at night, of machinery running long after sunset, of sealed crates carried away by helicopter. No one knew what they were digging for, but everyone felt what they were disturbing. Deep under layers of forgotten soil, the diggers unearthed a chamber that had not seen light for thousands of years. Its walls were smooth, untouched by time, carved with symbols that didn't belong to any known script. There were no idols, no offerings, just an eerie precision, as if the builders were mathematicians rather than worshippers. Among the workers, whispers began. Some said the chamber hummed softly, as if alive. Others claimed their equipment malfunctioned near its entrance. Within days, Vatican representatives arrived, their presence marked by silence and authority. They wore no uniforms, but everyone knew who they were. The site was cleared of local staff, and all findings were classified as unstable artifacts requiring preservation. Yet nothing about this operation resembled preservation. Everything was about control. There were documents that spoke of restricted shipments labelled for Rome, a handful of photos leaked online, showing strange inscriptions glowing faintly under ultraviolet light before disappearing into Vatican custody. Within a week, the entire site was sealed, filled back with sand as though nothing had ever been there. What could the church possibly want with ruins it had once condemned as cursed? Babylon, the city of confusion, where language was said to have fractured humanity. But maybe the real confusion was the story itself. Maybe the tower was not a monument to pride, but a gateway, a point of contact between man and something older than any scripture. If the Vatican found evidence of that, would they reveal it or hide it to protect the world from truths that could unmake their authority? When silence surrounds discovery, it is never by accident. Somewhere beneath the dust and stone of Babylon, something was found that could rewrite more than history. It could challenge the very origin of faith. And that is a story no institution ever once unearthed. For thousands of years, Babylon has been remembered as the city that defied heaven. The name itself became a symbol of pride, corruption, and divine punishment. In every sermon and scripture, it was painted as the home of arrogance, the city where mankind tried to climb to the level of God and was struck down. But history has a strange habit of echoing the voice of those who write it, and the image of Babylon that survived may not be the one that truly existed. When you strip away the biblical language and look at the ruins, you see something else, not chaos, but order, not decadence, but design. The bricks of Babylon were inscribed with the name of its builders, kings who saw the city as a mirror of the heavens. The alignment of its temples followed the stars. Its gardens flowed with engineering that rivaled Rome 1,000 years later. So how did a place that once celebrated knowledge become the eternal example of sin? The answer lies not in Babylon itself, but in the stories told long after it fell. In the centuries after its destruction, priests and scribes shaped its memory into a moral warning. They called it the City of Confusion, the Gate of Rebellion, a place cursed by God. The Church inherited that narrative, reinforcing it across generations until Babylon ceased to be a real city and became a myth to keep people afraid of questioning divine order. Yet behind this curse lies an obsession. For an institution that claims Babylon as the enemy of God, the Vatican has spent remarkable effort preserving what remains of it. Since the early 20th century, Vatican scholars have worked quietly in Mesopotamian studies, funding research teams and collecting cuneiform texts. They have never fully explained why. Officially, it is to better understand Scripture. Unofficially, it seems to be about control over the oldest memory of civilization itself. The more we learn about Babylon, the less it looks like a place of corruption. It looks like a center of knowledge, astronomy, and law. Perhaps even a society that understood the universe in ways later hidden or forgotten. To admit that would challenge the foundations of every religious empire that came after. So the curse of Babylon had to remain. To this day, the Vatican archives contain sealed records about the early archaeological expeditions near Hilla, the modern town beside the ruins. No one outside a narrow circle of clerics and historians knows what was found or why it was never published. Babylon's story was rewritten as a warning against human ambition. But what if that ambition was simply the desire to know the truth without needing permission? A city turned into a symbol of sin may have once been humanity's first light. And perhaps the real reason the Vatican cannot let Babylon go is because buried beneath its stones lies a version of history where man did not fall from grace, but rose toward understanding, and that is a story faith was never ready to tell. Every great mystery begins not with discovery, but with permission. And in the story of Babylon, the most curious permission of all was written not in stone, but in ink. Decades before cameras ever reached the desert ruins, quiet agreements were signed in offices far from the heat of Iraq. Among them was a document so obscure that even historians rarely mention it, a diplomatic memorandum granting the Vatican what were called special observational rights over certain archaeological sites in Mesopotamia. The words sounded harmless, almost academic, but their implications were enormous. These rights allowed Vatican representatives to review findings before they were made public, to classify artifacts deemed theologically sensitive, and to oversee the handling of any discovery connected to biblical history. It was presented as a gesture of respect toward religious heritage, but in practice, it placed the oldest records of human civilization under the Church's invisible supervision. The origins of this arrangement trace back to the aftermath of the Second World War, when Europe was rebuilding and the Middle East was redrawing its borders. archaeology had become a new kind of power, a race to claim the past before anyone else could rewrite it. Governments, universities, and secret societies competed for ancient knowledge, but only one institution had both spiritual authority and centuries of archival experience. The Vatican saw in Babylon not ruins but revelation, a chance to verify and, if necessary, reshape the evidence of human beginnings. Through diplomatic channels, they proposed cooperation with local governments, offering funding, expertise, and museum restoration in exchange for a small condition. The Church would have the right to observe and safeguard discoveries related to early religion. Few officials questioned it. The world was still recovering, and a promise of financial aid from Rome carried weight. Years later, fragments of correspondence surfaced in European archives referencing sealed crates labelled for Vatican storage, shipments from digs near Ur, Nineveh, and Babylon itself. The paperwork described them as replicas or incomplete artifacts, but the inventory lists were strangely vague. Scholars who requested access to those crates found their requests redirected or denied. The official explanation was always the same: preservation of sacred history. Yet one cannot help but wonder, preservation from what or from whom? If these contracts truly existed, they mean that for over half a century, every major excavation connected to the cradle of civilization has been shadowed by the Church. And if Babylon held traces of knowledge that predated Scripture, those traces would be quietly contained long before any museum could display them. The hidden contract was more than diplomacy. It was an invisible leash on humanity's oldest memory, a way to ensure that when the world looked back to its first cities, it would still see them through a lens of faith. And perhaps that is the greatest excavation of all, not the digging of earth, but the careful removal of truth until only a story remains, one written by the same hands that signed the contract. There are discoveries that change what we know, and then there are discoveries that change what we are allowed to know. The tunnel below the ziggurat belonged to the second kind. It was first uncovered in the spring of 2012, when a team of international excavators began clearing debris beneath what was once Babylon's main temple. They expected to find chambers used for offerings or tombs of priests, but instead they struck something far older, a sealed shaft lined with black stone so smooth it reflected their lights like glass. The entrance had been deliberately buried, layers of mud brick packed with an unnatural precision, as if someone wanted to make sure it would never be opened again. When the team finally broke through, the air that escaped was dry and heavy, preserved for millennia. It carried no scent of decay, only dust and silence. Inside, the walls were carved with patterns that made no sense. They were not cuneiform, not Egyptian, not anything recorded in known history. The markings curved like waves, then locked into angular spirals that seemed to shift under torchlight. Some of the workers swore the symbols formed repeating sequences, like mathematical formulas. The shaft descended deep, deeper than any structure known to exist beneath the ziggurat. At its end lay a circular chamber, unlike anything in Mesopotamian architecture. There were no idols, no altars, only geometric engravings aligned perfectly with the cardinal directions. When a compass was brought near, the needle began to spin. Instruments failed, batteries drained, and the lights flickered. The archaeologists were thrilled, but the mood changed when word reached their sponsors. Within 48 hours, Vatican observers arrived on site. The excavation was halted, and new regulations were imposed under the guise of safety concerns. Local workers were dismissed, replaced by specialists flown in from Rome. Reports of the discovery vanished from academic bulletins, and the official record of the dig was rewritten to describe routine maintenance of existing ruins. Yet witnesses remembered more. One engineer recalled a strange metallic object embedded in the floor of the chamber, shaped like a disc, engraved with lines matching constellations. Another claimed to have seen inscriptions that glowed faintly when the chamber was first opened. None of these accounts were ever verified because all access to the tunnel was closed, the entrance resealed, and the surrounding area declared unstable. What could have been so threatening about an ancient passage carved in stone? Some historians believe the tunnel predates Babylon itself, perhaps built by an earlier civilization whose knowledge vanished from history. Others suspect it was a storage chamber for relics carried from older cities destroyed in the floods of prehistory. Whatever its purpose, one fact remained. Beneath the temple of gods worshipped by men, there lay a design that spoke a language older than religion. And when those symbols resurfaced, someone decided it was safer for the world not to read them. The discovery came quietly, like most things meant to be hidden. During the second phase of excavation, a small team of archaeologists, clearing debris from the lower tunnels beneath Babylon, uncovered a cluster of clay tablets unlike any they had ever seen. They were buried in a layer of silt untouched since the time of Hammurabi, yet the clay was hard as stone, perfectly preserved, each surface engraved with symbols that seemed to shimmer under light. What startled the researchers was not the condition, but the language. It was neither Sumerian nor Akkadian, neither cuneiform nor hieroglyphic, but a fusion of many systems that should never have coexisted. One scholar described it as if someone from the future had tried to imitate the past. At first, they believed it was a hoax, perhaps a modern forgery placed there by smugglers, until radiocarbon testing dated the tablets to more than 4,000 years before the Common Era. Suddenly, the impossible was real. The inscriptions were arranged with mathematical precision, each line mirroring the movement of stars. A linguist from the University of London managed to translate a fragment that described cycles of destruction and renewal, a timeline of cataclysms that aligned disturbingly well with geological evidence of massive floods and volcanic winters. Another tablet depicted the sky in a way no ancient culture was thought capable of. It showed constellations visible only from above the equator, their positions marked with exact angular measurements. Whoever wrote it knew astronomy at a level equal to modern computation, but there was something stranger still. One text included instructions for building cities so that their streets and temples would resonate with the frequencies of certain stars, as if architecture itself was meant to harmonize with the cosmos. Within days of these translations being shared with the supervising committee, the Vatican team arrived. The lead archaeologist was told to suspend operations pending a review of religious sensitivity. By the end of that week, the tablets were packed in steel crates and loaded onto planes bound for Rome. The official report described them as damaged and unreadable, unfit for display. Yet photographs leaked by one of the translators told another story. The markings were sharp and clear, and several lines bore a repeated phrase in the unknown script, a pattern resembling the Latin root for light. When questioned, the translator vanished from public contact. The Vatican later announced the tablets would be studied privately for preservation, a phrase that has come to mean they will never be seen again. The workers who handled the crates said they felt a faint vibration, like a hum, when touching the clay. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps the ancients knew something that was never meant to fade. The tablets that should not exist became secrets that must not exist, reminders that our ancestors may have seen the stars, not as distant fire, but as mirrors of the divine, and that knowledge is dangerous only to those who fear its light. It began as a routine shipment. Dozens of wooden crates sealed in plastic and stamped with the insignia of the Baghdad Museum were loaded onto trucks at the edge of Babylon in the early summer of 2014. Each crate contained fragments of clay, tools, and tablets documented by the excavation team. Everything appeared normal, but somewhere along the long desert road, the record ends. The trucks never arrived at their destination. The official report claimed the convoy had been intercepted by looters, that the artifacts were either stolen or destroyed during unrest. For a while, everyone accepted it. War zones make perfect hiding places for missing history. But then, a few quiet voices began to speak. A driver from the convoy came forward, claiming they were rerouted halfway through their journey by men who presented new orders signed by foreign officials. The trucks were directed not north toward Baghdad, but west, to a private airfield under the supervision of a European security contractor. There, the crates were transferred to cargo planes marked for religious custodianship. Within weeks, those men vanished, and so did the artifacts. The story might have ended there, buried beneath bureaucracy, but a customs worker in Amman leaked photographs showing identical containers labelled as cultural preservation items bound for Rome. The labels bore the Vatican's emblem, though no one would confirm it. When journalists inquired, they were told it was a misunderstanding. Yet the chain of evidence told another story. Every document related to the excavation was quietly edited. Pages mentioning specific items were replaced with vague summaries. The lead archaeologist who had signed the inventory list resigned suddenly and left the country. What was once described as a set of Mesopotamian relics was now officially categorized as damaged materials of no historical value. But why would an institution renowned for precision risk such a sloppy cover-up, unless what was inside those crates was more than pottery and stone? Witnesses described one container heavier than the rest, its metal frame reinforced, guarded separately by armed personnel. Some believed it held one of the unknown tablets. Others thought it carried an object from the tunnel itself. The truth is, no one knows. The Baghdad Museum never received an official apology or explanation, and the records were locked under national secrecy laws. Years later, when independent researchers tried to track the shipment numbers through customs archives, they discovered the files had been erased completely. It was as if the crates had never been created. The Vatican, when questioned, stated simply that it had no involvement in the transport of archaeological materials from Babylon. Yet the pattern was too familiar. Every time something emerged that could alter the world's understanding of early civilization, it slipped quietly into private hands. The vanishing artifacts of Babylon were not stolen by thieves or lost by accident. They were taken deliberately, hidden in plain sight, so the past could remain obedient to the story written for it. The story first surfaced through a quiet academic paper that almost no one read. It was written by a Jesuit linguist named Father Matteo Solari, a man who had spent most of his life translating early Mesopotamian texts for the Vatican archives. His work was highly technical, focused on syntax and phonetics, never on speculation. But in the spring of 2015, a draft of his latest translation began circulating among his peers. It contained a claim so strange that it bordered on heresy. Solari wrote that the fragments from the Babylon excavation described beings called the Keepers of the Gate. They were not priests or kings in the way we understand them, but something else entirely. They were engineers of the sacred, architects who treated divinity not as worship but as a form of science. According to the text, these keepers were trained to align temples with specific points in the sky. Each structure acted as a harmonic bridge between earth and heaven, channeling energy through sound, geometry, and ritual motion. Solari noted that their language combined numbers and words so precisely that a single phrase could function both as a prayer and as a mathematical formula. He called it a dual tongue. one capable of describing both physics and faith. In one surviving line, the keepers claim to open the gate between worlds not through magic, but through resonance, using vibration and light. The symbols for these processes were almost identical to those found later in ancient Greek and Hebrew mysticism, though the Babylonian versions were thousands of years older. If true, this meant that the roots of theology and science were once the same branch, and that ancient humanity may have understood creation in ways that modern civilization has only begun to rediscover. After the paper circulated, Solari was summoned to Rome. He never published the full translation. His colleagues received a message announcing his indefinite sabbatical for health reasons, but no one ever heard from him again. Weeks later, the digital copies of his paper vanished from academic servers, replaced with corrupted files. The few surviving excerpts spoke of sacred architecture designed not to praise gods, but to manipulate the structure of reality itself. The keepers saw heaven not as a place above, but as a frequency, and they built temples as instruments to reach it. This interpretation could have redefined every major religion on earth. If worship was once an act of engineering, then prayer was not submission, it was participation. The church could never allow that idea to spread. Some say Solari was relocated to a monastery under vows of silence. Others whisper that his translation remains hidden deep in the Vatican archive beside the forbidden tablets. Whatever the truth, his discovery offered one haunting possibility. The first priest-kings were not servants of gods, but builders of connection, custodians of a science so pure it became indistinguishable from faith, a science that someone decided must never be spoken again. When scholars finally examined the few surviving images of the forbidden tablets before they were confiscated, what they saw defied every timeline ever taught in history. Instead of hymns or prayers, the clay slabs were filled with sketches and calculations. They looked more like blueprints than scripture. Perfect circles intersected with star patterns, canals curved into geometric precision, and strange funnel-shaped structures appeared repeatedly beside symbols for sound and water. It was as if the builders of ancient Babylon had designed temples not just for worship but for energy. One diagram showed an underground chamber shaped like a spiral cone. The inner walls were etched with markings resembling musical scales. Researchers speculated that these carvings could be instructions for creating resonance, guiding sound through stone to amplify vibration. Another image depicted a network of canals aligned with celestial positions, possibly to reflect starlight into specific chambers during solstices. Such alignment required a level of astronomical knowledge and engineering skill that should not have existed thousands of years before modern civilization. Yet the drawings were too detailed to dismiss as symbolic art. The Vatican scholars who reviewed them privately used the term spiritual infrastructure, an architecture built to harness natural forces for what they called divine contact. To the ancient world, sound was not merely noise, but a living current capable of shaping matter. In nearly every surviving culture, there are echoes of this belief. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, even the cathedrals of Europe were built with acoustics that magnify the human voice into something that feels infinite. What if that tradition began here, in Babylon, where spiritual experience was engineered through physics? When the news of these diagrams first reached the academic world, there was excitement, followed by silence. The original pieces disappeared into private archives within weeks. The official explanation claimed they were too fragile for transport and had been moved for preservation, but insiders whispered that their contents were too dangerous, that they suggested a link between ancient ritual and lost technology. If people learned that faith once had a measurable foundation, that divine connection was the result of knowledge rather than miracles, centuries of religious control would fracture overnight. Some of the leaked notes described devices that used vibration and magnetism to induce states of altered consciousness. The ancients may have discovered how to synchronize the human mind with planetary frequencies, creating the feeling of oneness with the cosmos. Imagine temples not as places of worship, but as instruments designed to tune the soul. Modern science has only begun to explore how frequency affects matter, yet the Babylonians may have mastered it. The blueprints of this forbidden science vanished before they could be studied further, locked away where only a few may see them. Perhaps the Church feared what would happen if humanity remembered that the sacred once had a formula, that heaven was not above us, but something we could build. Everyone has heard the story of the Tower of Babel. It is one of the most famous tales in Scripture. Humanity, united under one language, decides to build a tower so high it can reach heaven. God, angered by their pride, scatters them and confuses their tongues. But what if this story was never about arrogance at all? What if it was about something far more dangerous to those who would later rule faith itself? Hidden within the forbidden tablets was a retelling of that same event, but the tone was entirely different. There was no mention of divine punishment, no God striking man for hubris. Instead, it spoke of a moment when humanity achieved a shared knowledge so complete that distance and language no longer divided them. The tower was not a building of stone, but a symbol for a network of wisdom, a world where science, art, and spirit were one and the same. The tablets described it as the harmony of tongues, a time when knowledge flowed freely across lands. People built cities aligned to the same stars, and temples resonated to the same frequencies. They understood energy, sound, and creation, not as separate subjects, but as one truth. Then something happened. The inscriptions said the unity was broken not by divine will, but by those who sought control. A council of priest-kings feared that if every person could access the sacred science, no one would need them as intermediaries. And so they fractured the knowledge, dividing language, burning scripts, and creating a myth to hide what they had done. The tower became a metaphor of sin, not enlightenment. This rewriting turned humanity's greatest collaboration into a warning against curiosity. The tablets hinted that after this event, survivors carried fragments of the old system to distant lands. Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, and even Mesoamerica all kept traces of the same geometry and cosmology, evidence of a forgotten unity that once spanned the globe. Archaeologists have long noted these parallels, but called them coincidence. What if they were remnants of that first network, the real Tower of Babel? The Vatican's interest in Babylon suddenly makes sense through this lens. If these tablets are genuine, they threaten the foundations of organized faith. They reveal that humanity once reached toward the divine not in defiance, but in understanding, and that the so-called confusion of languages was engineered to keep that power contained. The Church's survival depends on the belief that connection to the divine must pass through its gates, but a civilization that once achieved that connection directly would expose the illusion. The story of Babel was not about a tower that fell, it was about a truth that was buried, and those who buried it ensured that the world would remember only the lesson of punishment, never the possibility that heaven was once within reach, not through miracles, but through knowledge shared freely by all. There are discoveries that threaten power not because they are false, but because they are true in a way that changes everything. The findings buried beneath Babylon strike at the very heart of religious authority. If the tablets and tunnels reveal that humans once had access to what the ancients called the divine field, without priests, rituals, or sacred institutions, then the foundation of every hierarchical religion begins to crumble. For centuries, The Church has taught that salvation comes through mediation, that a person must go through a chosen representative of God to reach heaven. But what if the people of Babylon had already discovered a direct connection to that divine source through science, geometry, and resonance? That would mean the human spirit was never fallen or separated, only forgotten. Such a truth would dissolve the very need for organized intercession. Throughout history, control of the sacred has been the most powerful form of control. If people believe only a select few can interpret divine will, then faith becomes a chain disguised as guidance. But the Babylonian model, as described in the hidden fragments, portrayed divinity not as a distant being, but as a living energy woven into everything. The ancients seemed to understand that prayer, sound, and architecture could create a resonance between the human mind and the universe itself. No confession, no ritual, no priestly permission, just awareness. Imagine what that would mean for an institution built on being the gatekeeper between humanity and God. The very idea would be intolerable. This is why the Vatican moved swiftly once reports from the excavation reached Rome. Within weeks, all related research was classified. Scholars were told that the information could cause spiritual confusion. It was not confusion they feared, it was liberation. The notion that human beings could access divine consciousness independently was heresy long before the word existed. It renders hierarchy meaningless and turns every individual into their own temple. If Babylon preserved even a fragment of this knowledge, its exposure would force the Church to admit that its centuries of mediation were unnecessary. It would also challenge the foundation of modern science, which still insists on separating matter and spirit. The ancient records hint that both are one continuum, a truth too vast for any single doctrine to contain. When power depends on being the bridge to heaven, the discovery that no bridge is needed becomes the ultimate threat. So the Church does what it has always done when faced with dangerous truth. It seals it away, wraps it in silence, and declares that some knowledge is too sacred for the public. But history shows that buried truths never stay buried. They whisper through time, waiting for those willing to listen. The people of Babylon may have known what humanity forgot, that the divine is not above or beyond us, but within, and once that memory returns, no wall of faith can keep it hidden forever. In the autumn of 2016, a rumour began to circulate among certain academic circles in Rome. It spoke of a meeting held behind the marble walls of the Apostolic Palace, a gathering of minds summoned not for ceremony but for damage control. Later known among insiders as the Council of Hidden Findings, this quiet assembly was said to have been called after a series of internal reports reached the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Those reports contained early translations from the Babylon tablets and private notes from the Jesuit linguist Father Solari, the same man who vanished months earlier. What they revealed was deeply troubling. The text described civilizations that existed long before the biblical timeline, cultures that mapped the heavens with precision and understood cosmic laws beyond anything accepted by modern theology. These findings threatened to unravel centuries of interpretation, casting doubt on the idea that divine knowledge entered the world only through Scripture. According to leaked correspondence, the council included cardinals, scientists from the Pontifical Academy, and select historians sworn to secrecy. Their task was not to study the discoveries, but to decide what to do with them. A defector later claimed the first discussion centered on how to integrate the findings into existing doctrine without admitting contradiction. One proposal suggested rebranding the Babylonian records as symbolic, claiming they prefigured divine revelation rather than predated it. But others in the room understood the danger. If the public learned that ancient societies had mastered astronomy, magnetism, and resonance, thousands of years before Christ, then the Church's claim as the guardian of divine truth would weaken beyond repair. The second proposal was distortion. Reframe the tablets as mythic allegory, attribute their precision to coincidence, and quietly encourage academic skepticism. This tactic had worked before, especially with apocryphal gospels and suppressed manuscripts. Yet some argued even that was too risky. Once the idea spread, curiosity could not be contained. The final and chosen path was burial. The artifacts would be reclassified as religiously sensitive materials, removed from academic access, and stored in the restricted section of the Vatican archives. Scholars involved in the excavation were offered grants, positions, or silence. Those who refused were dismissed or discredited. The official statement released months later described the Babylon findings as inconclusive. The world moved on, unaware that a council had just decided the fate of one of the most important discoveries in human history. Behind closed doors, the Church did what it had always done when confronted with knowledge too vast for its narrative. It folded truth into secrecy, turning revelation into rumor. Yet one line from the supposed minutes of that meeting still circulates among researchers today. It reads, "If man once knew the cosmos as creator knows creation, then revelation was never given, it was remembered." That single sentence explains why the council was necessary. To admit it would mean that the divine spark was never exclusive, and that the heavens had always been within human reach. By the spring of 2017, Babylon fell silent again. The archaeologists, contractors, and military escorts were gone. What had begun as a carefully managed Vatican-funded excavation was suddenly shut down without explanation. The official statement issued by the Iraqi Ministry of Culture claimed the tunnels beneath the site were sealed for safety due to unstable soil and the risk of collapse. But those who had seen the satellite images before they vanished knew that something much larger had happened. The underground network beneath the ziggurat was not a simple tunnel system. It was an entire complex, stretching for kilometers beneath the ancient ruins, with chambers, shafts, and what appeared to be a vast circular structure deep below the temple foundations. Then, one morning, it was gone. The entrances, once visible from aerial scans, were covered with thick layers of sand and concrete. Bulldozers flattened the ground, and all access routes were blocked by armed guards claiming to protect the site from looters. Within weeks, every public record related to the excavation was edited. Reports once filled with detailed descriptions of underground structures now ended abruptly with the word inconclusive. The names of researchers were removed, replaced with new signatures belonging to people who had never been on site. Photographs vanished from archives. Even references in digital databases were quietly overwritten. A few independent archaeologists who attempted to revisit the area were stopped by local authorities and told the site was under preservation quarantine. Yet no preservation signs were ever erected. Whistleblowers later claimed that entire crates of material had been flown out of Iraq in military cargo planes under diplomatic protection. Their destination was never listed. Some of those same containers were traced to Rome through cargo manifests marked as cultural property under Vatican custody. What exactly was sealed beneath the ruins remains unknown, but fragments of testimony from local workers suggest the tunnels connected to structures far older than Babylon itself, made from stone harder than any used in the era and carved with symbols no one could read. Some described metallic doors and smooth surfaces that reflected light like mirrors. Others spoke of a low hum that filled the air near certain chambers, as if the earth itself was vibrating. When these accounts reached the media, they were dismissed as folklore, but within weeks, those same workers disappeared or were relocated. Even the satellite imagery showing the sealed sections of Babylon was replaced online with older maps, as if the new data had never existed. The world moved on, unaware that an entire underground city had been erased from history in a matter of months. The tunnels were sealed, the records rewritten, and the silence restored. Yet beneath the dust and stone, the truth remains entombed, waiting, because no wall, no matter how thick, can hold back a secret built to outlast time itself. In the sealed fragments recovered before the tunnels were buried, there are passages that speak not of Babylon, but of something far older. The words describe what the translators called the original garden civilization, a place where human beings lived in complete harmony with the earth and the sky. The texts claim that this civilization did not worship gods, but worked alongside the natural forces that shaped creation. They used sound, magnetism, and celestial alignment to maintain balance in both the physical and spiritual worlds. The descriptions are so vivid, they almost read like the memory of Eden itself, but not the Eden we were taught. In these fragments, the garden was not a paradise gifted by a creator. It was an achievement built by human hands, guided by knowledge, that merged science and spirituality. It was a place of learning, not innocence. The people of this garden were called the architects of breath, beings who understood that life itself was an energy field to be tuned, not ruled. The ancient text said they wove songs into rivers, used light to grow stone into shape, and measured time through the heartbeat of the earth. It was not myth. It was technology beyond comprehension, a living system in which the planet and its inhabitants functioned as one organism. This idea directly challenges the Church's most sacred narrative. If humanity once lived in balance through knowledge, then the story of the fall, the belief that mankind was cast out for seeking forbidden truth, becomes something else entirely. It becomes propaganda to erase the memory of a time when knowing was divine, not sinful. The Vatican's theologians could never allow such an interpretation to surface. If the Eden story was not about disobedience, but about a lost age of mastery, the entire framework of salvation collapses. There is no fall, no original sin, no need for redemption. Humanity would not need saving. It would only need remembering. Some researchers who glimpsed the fragments noted that they described a cataclysm, an event that destroyed this garden civilization. It spoke of the balance being broken, of sound turned against itself, and of leaders who began to hoard the sacred frequencies for power. The harmony became control, and the garden fell not by divine wrath, but by human greed. The survivors, it said, carried fragments of their knowledge to distant lands, planting seeds of memory that became myths of gods, temples, and holy places. If this is true, then the echoes of Eden have always been with us, hidden within architecture, music, and the forgotten sciences of resonance. The Church built its empire on the idea that man fell from grace. But what if grace was not lost, only taken? The fragments whisper of an ancient truth too dangerous for religion to admit, that paradise was once human, and it can be built again. In one of the confiscated tablets from the Babylon dig, there is an image that caused immediate alarm among Vatican scholars. It shows a human figure kneeling before a serpent, but instead of recoiling in fear, the person is listening. The serpent coils upward, its mouth open, releasing what appears to be light or sound waves. Around them are symbols of stars, plants, and the human body. The accompanying script, once translated, revealed something extraordinary. The serpent was not a deceiver. It was a teacher. The text describes the serpent as the bringer of the hidden arts, the one who taught early humanity how to read the stars, mix healing herbs, and create language. It called the serpent the bearer of the first word, a being who opened the mind of man. In this account, there was no mention of sin, no curse, no fall from grace. Instead, the serpent's gift was enlightenment, the awakening of human awareness. For the Vatican, this was catastrophic. In Christian doctrine, the serpent represents the devil, the tempter who led mankind away from obedience. But in the tablet, the serpent is portrayed as the spark that began civilization itself. It is the symbol of knowledge, of the mind's first light. If this interpretation were ever made public, the entire framework of good and evil would be called into question. The story of Eden would no longer be about the punishment of disobedience, but the price of awakening. The forbidden fruit would not be sin, it would be understanding. Ancient cultures across the world, from Egypt to India, also depicted serpents as symbols of wisdom, energy, and rebirth. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, represented infinity. The coiled serpent in Hindu tradition symbolized the energy that rises through the human spine to awaken consciousness. Even in early Gnostic writings, the serpent was seen as the liberator of humanity from ignorance. Somehow, this Babylonian tablet united all these threads into a single image, the serpent as the teacher of light. The Church could not permit this narrative to resurface. If the devil was once the source of wisdom, then who was truly keeping humanity in the dark? Within days of its translation, the artifact was removed from public record. The linguist who made the transcription was reassigned to the Vatican Observatory and never spoke publicly again. But rumours spread among those who had seen the tablet. They said it described a moment in human history when knowledge was free, when the serpent's light taught men how to understand the heavens without fear. Then something changed. The keepers of power declared that, light forbidden, the serpent became the enemy, and ignorance became sacred. Theological implication became control. Perhaps that is why the serpent remains a symbol feared and misunderstood, not because it is evil, but because it remembers the truth that knowledge was once divine, and awakening was the first act of courage. When a small team of astronomers began analysing the symbols found on the Babylon tablets, they expected to see records of past celestial events. Instead, they discovered something far more complex. A star map that did not only record history, but predicted it. The pattern etched into the clay corresponded with known constellations, yet several were arranged in ways that matched no ancient sky. When the data was plotted using modern astronomical software, the alignments pointed not to the past, but to a date still to come. The map was a timing grid, an ancient clock of the heavens designed to mark the rise and fall of ages. The inscriptions referred to cycles of light and shadow, when the balance between Earth and the cosmos shifted. It spoke of an era when the stars would mirror the sky of the first dawn, the return of the pattern that once governed the original garden civilization. The ancients called it the convergence. The text hinted that those who understood these cycles could predict great floods, droughts, or even the collapse of empires. It was knowledge so vast that it blurred the line between astronomy and prophecy. The implications were enormous. If the map truly predicted the rhythm of civilization, then whoever held it could control the narrative of destiny itself. The Vatican's reaction was swift. Access to the astronomical data from the Babylon excavation was revoked, and the images of the star carvings disappeared from research databases. The official reason was that the findings were still under verification. But insiders revealed that a secret team within the Pontifical Academy of Sciences had already decoded the full map. They discovered that the next major alignment would occur near the middle of the 21st century, coinciding with a rare conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo, the same region of the sky ancient texts called the Throne of the King. This alignment was said to open what the tablets called the Gate of Renewal, a period when human consciousness could shift in resonance with the heavens. If this knowledge became public, it could redefine how the world viewed prophecy, religion, and time itself. For centuries, the Church has claimed to guard divine revelation. But if the stars themselves carry a timeline of change, then prophecy is not given from heaven, but calculated from the cosmos. To reveal that truth would strip away the mystery and expose prophecy as a science disguised as faith. The Vatican could never allow that. The star map of Babylon remains hidden, perhaps locked within the same vaults as the forbidden tablets, guarded not because it is false, but because it might be true. For if humanity ever learns to read the sky, as their ancestors once did, they would no longer look upward in fear, but in understanding. And those who have ruled through prophecy would lose the one thing they cannot live without, the control of time. In the winter of 2018, Father Alessandro Verdi stood before a small audience of students and academics at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He was a quiet man, known for his meticulous work cataloguing ancient Mesopotamian texts. That afternoon, he deviated from his prepared lecture. With a hushed tone, he suggested that some of the Babylonian fragments hinted at revelations that could force a reinterpretation of Genesis itself. He spoke of a civilization that had understood the heavens, the earth, and humanity's place within both, long before the story of the Garden of Eden was written. His words were careful but revolutionary. The audience felt the weight of what he implied. That knowledge, if confirmed, could challenge centuries of doctrine and rewrite the understanding of original sin and creation. Within days, rumours of the lecture spread quietly among Vatican circles. Scholars who had attended were summoned to private meetings, asked to refrain from discussing what they had heard. Verdi himself received a series of visits from senior clerics, emphasizing discretion and loyalty. By the spring, he submitted his resignation. No official reason was given, and the news was presented as a voluntary departure to focus on personal study. Friends and colleagues were uneasy. Verdi had never shown signs of discontent, and his work was considered exemplary. When his office was cleared, his notes, drafts, and research files vanished. Digital records were deleted, cloud backups removed, and even printed copies disappeared from library shelves. The fragments of Babylon he had been studying were never returned to him, and his translations were classified under a top-secret Vatican seal. Some whispered that he had been reassigned to a monastery under strict silence. Others suggested he had been quietly instructed never to publish. Those who had seen his notes claimed they contained careful comparisons between Babylonian astronomical charts and biblical passages, showing correlations that suggested the Genesis narrative was a reflection, not an origin, of human knowledge. They hinted at a time when humans accessed the divine field directly, without priests, without ritual, and without the restrictions later imposed by organized religion. The implication was explosive. To suggest that the Garden of Eden was not a story of sin but a memory of human achievement was to undermine the foundational story of salvation. Verdi had touched something the Church could not permit. In the months following his resignation, the academic world noticed a strange void. References to Mesopotamian revelations vanished from conference programs and journals. Scholars who had previously studied Babylon were redirected to other projects. Any lecture or article hinting at these connections was quietly withdrawn. Yet despite the secrecy, fragments of his ideas persist in whispers, in footnotes, removed from public view, and in private conversations. Father Verdi became an invisible figure, a reminder that in some corners of history, knowledge carries a cost. And when that knowledge threatens centuries of control, even the most careful scholar can find their work erased, their voice silenced, and their discoveries buried alongside the truths they were meant to reveal. Throughout history, there is a strange and unsettling pattern. When ancient texts surface that could challenge centralized authority, they do not simply circulate freely. Instead, they are delayed, redacted, or hidden in special collections far from the public eye. Babylon was one such example, but it is far from the only one. Consider Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the spring of 1947. For decades, scholars were allowed only limited access. Pieces of the collection were withheld, some hidden for more than 20 years. Documents that could have rewritten our understanding of Judaism and early Christianity were slowly released, carefully curated, and even misdated to maintain continuity with accepted history. A similar story emerges at Nag Hammadi, in the deserts of Upper Egypt. When the Gnostic codices were found in 1945, the world learned of texts that described Christ not as a distant saviour, but as a teacher of inner knowledge, urging personal awakening. Scholars who requested the original manuscripts often encountered restrictions, censorship, and bureaucratic obstacles. Even the most cautious researchers noticed that the texts were fragmented, with pages intentionally missing or kept under strict guard. The parallels are striking. Each time a discovery threatens the monopoly of belief, the discovery is controlled. History itself is curated. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gnostic codices, Babylonian tablets, and now fragments allegedly describing the first priest kings all share this fate. They emerge briefly, only to be swallowed by secrecy. It is never random. There is always a pattern. Those who have wielded spiritual or political authority understand the danger of uncontrolled knowledge. If humanity remembers that divine insight can be achieved without intermediaries, the foundations of power shift. A text in the wrong hands can inspire movements, ignite inquiry, and challenge the accepted narrative. The careful preservation in restricted archives, delayed publication, and selective release of ancient manuscripts has created an invisible chain of control across time. The same institutions, or their successors, consistently appear where sensitive knowledge is unearthed. This is particularly evident in the Vatican, which maintains unprecedented control over thousands of documents, many from the earliest civilizations. Researchers who uncover anything contradictory are often silenced, reassigned, or misdirected. The result is a world in which history, religion, and science are filtered before reaching public awareness. Each revelation is measured against the potential for disruption. The pattern extends beyond the church. Other religious and political authorities follow similar protocols, delaying or suppressing materials that could empower independent thought. This systemic censorship is not an accident. It is a deliberate design to maintain control over collective memory. When we look at the fragments of Babylon, Qumran, and Nag Hammadi together, it becomes clear that humanity's understanding of its past has been carefully curated. Some truths were preserved but locked away, others deliberately fragmented, and the rest quietly erased. This pattern is a warning. History is rarely neutral. It is a tool wielded by those with power, shaping not only what we know, but how we understand ourselves. And whenever we find traces of knowledge that seem too advanced or too dangerous, it is no coincidence that they vanish before we can fully comprehend them. In the summer of 2003, as bombs fell across Baghdad, the world watched with television cameras trained on the crumbling streets. Archaeological sites that had survived centuries of sand and sun were suddenly at risk of being erased. The official stories spoke of looters and terrorist destruction. Images of masked men carrying priceless artifacts across broken roads were broadcast around the globe. But for those who followed the quiet movements behind the scenes, a different story emerges. While chaos raged, certain shipments of Mesopotamian relics quietly disappeared from public view. Crates labelled as museum property were diverted at airports and military checkpoints. Containers that should have gone to Baghdad's National Museum or regional archaeological offices were instead flown to undisclosed locations. Some arrived in private collections. Others, according to leaked diplomatic cables, were directed to Vatican-controlled archives under the pretext of preservation. Modern warfare, it seems, has a convenient side effect for those who wish history to remain selective. While media focuses on destruction, looting, and casualty, artifacts can be redirected without anyone noticing. Entire libraries of cuneiform tablets, rare clay models, and fragments of sculptures that could illuminate lost civilizations vanish, while headlines proclaim the tragedy of war. And the more dramatic the destruction, the easier it becomes to mask what is removed. Satellite imagery, which might have tracked these movements, is often classified or ignored. What remains visible is rubble, burned ruins, and chaos, giving the impression that the past itself has been destroyed. In reality, much of it has been relocated under tight control, preserved not for public knowledge, but for selective access. Reports from whistleblowers in Iraq mention unmarked flights landing at secure airfields in Europe, guarded by men in plainclothes with diplomatic clearance. Museum officials, who requested tracking information, were met with bureaucratic obstacles or reassigned before they could complete their inquiries. Even academic publications were delayed or edited, with key findings omitted or described vaguely to prevent awareness of what had actually been recovered. The pattern repeats across decades. When looting or terrorist destruction occurs, certain discoveries vanish, while others are left to be catalogued in public records as damaged, stolen, or destroyed. This creates a narrative of loss that justifies secrecy. Meanwhile, select findings are quietly studied, analysed, and stored, sometimes under the Vatican's supervision, sometimes in private hands, always shielded from the broader world. By framing war as the enemy of history, the public remains unaware that it is not the bombs or the looters who control the record, but the institutions that decide what may be preserved and what must vanish. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, has become a theatre in which chaos conceals deliberate curation. And in the shadows of these destroyed cities, the real treasures of the past continue to exist, unseen, inaccessible, and carefully hidden from those who might question the narrative. From the earliest days, control over human origin stories has been a form of power more effective than armies or laws. The narratives taught to children, inscribed in sacred texts, and recited from pulpits shape the way societies understand themselves. When people are told that consciousness, morality, and the foundations of law descend from divine revelation, they grow up dependent on those who interpret that revelation. They believe they need priests, scholars, and rulers to tell them right from wrong, to guide them through life, and to maintain order. This is the ultimate weapon, subtle and lasting. The Vatican, along with other religious authorities throughout history, has understood this principle better than most. By managing the story of human origins, they can influence not just faith, but thought itself. If the record of humanity's beginnings is kept incomplete, controlled, or distorted, the population accepts a reality that is carefully curated. Now imagine if people discovered an alternative history. One in which early civilizations like Babylon, Sumer, or even a lost garden civilization possessed knowledge of the stars, mathematics, and human potential long before organized religion. One in which consciousness and morality were cultivated through study, observation, and self-mastery rather than conferred through scripture. If that knowledge resurfaced, control would shatter. People would realize that the so-called fall from grace was a story designed to centralize authority. They would see that humans have always had the capacity to understand the cosmos, to align with its laws, and to create order without intermediaries. That is precisely why the Babylonian tablets, the hidden tunnels, and the secret archives are so dangerous. They are not just artifacts. They are proof that self-empowerment was once possible and perhaps could be again. By preserving or suppressing these records, those in power maintain a theological framework that keeps humanity compliant. The story of origins becomes a scaffold upon which obedience is built. It shapes education, law, and culture, reinforcing the idea that knowledge must come from a sanctioned source. And yet, scattered fragments suggest an older reality: the first priest kings, the resonant temples, the original garden civilization, the serpent as teacher, and star maps of cosmic cycles all point to a model of human capability far beyond what official doctrine allows. Awareness of this model would destabilize centuries of authority. Even the act of reading becomes revolutionary if the knowledge challenges sanctioned history. The theology of managed origins is therefore not about faith alone. It is about the governance of possibility. If the past shows humans could achieve, understand, and govern themselves without intermediaries, then reliance on the church or any centralized authority is revealed as a construct, not a necessity. Control of memory, archives, and interpretation is control of the present and the future. By shaping origin stories, the gatekeepers determine what humanity believes it can be, and when belief shifts, the power they wield begins to crumble. This is why hidden knowledge is not just academic curiosity. It is a threat to centuries of imposed order, and why those who guard it act with unwavering secrecy, ensuring that the story humanity tells itself remains a story of dependence rather than potential. The fragments from Babylon whisper a message that has been buried for millennia. Piecing together the leaked translations, sketches, and partial transcripts, a pattern emerges that speaks not to the past alone, but to the future. The texts suggest that humans were designed not merely to survive or obey, but to remember. To remember the rhythms of the cosmos, the cycles of light and energy, and the way that consciousness can resonate with the universe itself. This was knowledge never meant to be lost. The original garden civilization, the priest kings, the hidden temples, the serpent as teacher, all point to a single principle. Humans are capable of aligning themselves directly with the forces that govern the world, without intermediaries, without ritual, without priestly permission. It is a blueprint for self-empowerment encoded in stone, clay, and vibration. The tablets describe architecture that harmonizes with planetary positions, sound chambers that tune thought, and codes embedded in language that connect mind and cosmos. These designs were not symbolic. They were functional. They were instructions for living within the natural order rather than being bound by it. If this knowledge were widely known, it would redefine humanity's place in history. Civilization would no longer depend on hierarchical interpretation to access meaning or morality. Learning, wisdom, and insight could be reclaimed by anyone willing to seek it. This is what makes the archaeology forbidden. It is not that the artifacts are dangerous in the conventional sense. It is that they carry the power to liberate the human mind from dependence on authority. The message repeats in every fragment. The stars, the earth, the flow of water, and the vibration of sound are all part of a system humans were meant to remember. To forget is to remain under control. To remember is to awaken. Some passages are nearly poetic, describing humans standing beneath the sky and recalling their origins, feeling the pulse of the planets beneath their feet. Others are technical, with diagrams of chambers, canals, and geometric alignments that encode timing, resonance, and instruction. All point toward a single goal, the restoration of cycles of wisdom. The Vatican, aware of the potential, has sealed much of this knowledge to prevent its dissemination. They know that if the methods for remembering and realigning were taught, centuries of centralized control over faith, education, and history could dissolve. Yet the fragments endure, scattered across archives, whispered in academic circles, and glimpsed in unauthorized translations. Babylon's message to the future is clear. Humanity is not inherently powerless. It is capable of reconnecting with the cosmos, of reconstructing cycles of knowledge, of accessing understanding without waiting for permission. The forbidden archaeology is therefore not just a record of what once was. It is an invitation to remember, to rebuild, and to reclaim the destiny that was quietly hidden from us, to awaken in the same light that our ancestors once knew, and to shine it for ourselves. Beneath the marble floors of Vatican City lies a place few have ever seen, and even fewer have imagined. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, or the Vatican Secret Archive, is often spoken of in whispers, a library not of books alone, but of power itself. Within its stone walls are millions of documents, manuscripts, and maps, many of which have never been catalogued publicly, and among these treasures, according to defectors and scholars who have glimpsed its contents, sit the artifacts taken from Babylon. The clay tablets, the diagrams of temples and tunnels, the fragments hinting at lost sciences, all rest beside suppressed gospels that never reached circulation, maps that contradict established history, and chronologies that could rewrite the timeline of civilization itself. The vault is designed to be impenetrable, both physically and administratively. Researchers must apply years in advance, specifying each document they intend to consult. Photography is forbidden. Copies are denied. Even the scholars allowed to enter report that they are escorted at all times and that access is limited to mere hours each day. The collection is not curated for public enlightenment, it is curated for control. Every scroll and tablet is a potential revolution, a challenge to authority if revealed. Here, Babylon meets the forgotten worlds of Gnosticism, the hidden calendars of pre-Christian civilizations, and the maps that suggest humanity once understood the earth and stars far more completely than modern textbooks admit. Some of the documents describe methods to access consciousness directly, align with celestial cycles, and achieve understanding without intermediaries. Others contain instructions for ancient technologies, devices, and constructions that modern science cannot replicate. The organization of the archive itself seems deliberate, designed to fragment knowledge. Ancient Babylonian texts are stored separately from Gnostic manuscripts. Maps are hidden away from historical records, and cross-referencing is made nearly impossible. Even within the walls, knowledge is compartmentalized, access controlled, and discovery accidental. Scholars who have hinted at connections between these materials often vanish from academic life. They resign, are reassigned, or are silenced in subtle ways that leave no official trace. The message is clear. This vault is not a library in the conventional sense. It is a repository of human potential, a record of everything the powers that be do not want humanity to remember. And within that knowledge lies the possibility of awakening. The tablets from Babylon, now resting alongside forbidden texts, hold the keys to technologies, philosophies, and understandings that could bypass centuries of imposed doctrine. The archive is not simply a place of storage. It is the heart of a centuries-long system of control. To enter it is to glimpse the shadow of what we are not allowed to know. To even imagine the contents is to confront the truth that history, religion, and science have been curated, and that the world we see today is only a fraction of the knowledge that humanity has always possessed. The vault beneath the Vatican is therefore not merely a physical space. It is a monument to secrecy, to power, and to the extraordinary ideas that sleep there, waiting for the day they might be remembered. In the years following the closure of the Babylon dig, a handful of scholars began to work in the shadows, piecing together what they could from scraps of information. Independent archaeologists, linguists, and former clergy with knowledge of ancient texts attempted to reconstruct the findings, relying on photographs smuggled out of the site, handwritten notes, and satellite imagery captured before the tunnels were sealed. Each fragment alone seemed insignificant. A blurry photo of a carved wall, a partial transcription of a tablet, a sketch of a star alignment. But when examined collectively, patterns emerged that were too precise to be dismissed. The symbols repeated across media. The diagrams of chambers matched descriptions in multiple notes, and the star alignments correlated with those predicted in the forbidden Babylonian texts. These researchers worked quietly, aware that exposure could end their careers or worse. Some were threatened with lawsuits or reassigned to unrelated projects. Others found their funding cut without explanation, their grants rescinded as if their very curiosity was criminal. A few were publicly discredited. Articles appeared in academic journals calling their conclusions speculative, unfounded, or conspiracy theory. Yet, the evidence persisted. Each scholar, working from independent sources, arrived at remarkably similar reconstructions of the tunnel layouts, resonance chambers, and celestial alignments. Even more disturbing were the claims about the stolen artifacts. Multiple whistleblowers from military and transport teams confirmed that crates, supposedly lost in transit, were diverted to Vatican custody. The fragments collected by these shadow scholars suggested a continuity of knowledge from Babylon to secret archives in Rome, an entire system of lost science and wisdom deliberately withheld from the public. Some of the linguists focused on the hybrid script found on the tablets. They noted that it was neither purely Sumerian nor Akkadian, but a mixture that incorporated elements of mathematics, astronomy, and symbolic logic. Attempts to publish these findings were consistently blocked. One ex-cleric, who had worked in Vatican libraries, tried to expose the links between Babylonian knowledge and suppressed Gospels. Within weeks, his access was revoked, and he was reassigned to a remote monastery. Despite these obstacles, the fragments compiled by these independent scholars converged with uncanny precision. Maps aligned with diagrams of chambers, texts hinted at resonance technologies, and celestial predictions matched star charts. The convergence suggested that something extraordinary had existed beneath Babylon, something the official narrative had erased. The pattern of suppression, discrediting, and silencing created a chilling message. Curiosity about forbidden knowledge comes with a cost. And yet, even in this environment of fear, the fragments refuse to vanish completely. They whisper to those willing to listen. They hint at a civilization that understood the universe directly, at a time when humans once accessed knowledge without intermediaries. The work of these scholars proves that the story of Babylon, the ziggurat, and the tablets cannot be fully hidden. Even in the shadows, the truth finds a way to emerge, and the fragments align too well to be ignored. Imagine for a moment that one complete Babylonian tablet, fully intact and translated, appeared in public view. It would not merely be an artifact, it would be a revelation that challenges the very structure of history, theology, and human understanding. For centuries, humanity has been taught that civilizations before recorded scripture were primitive, that knowledge and morality were gifts delivered through prophets and priests, and that faith alone guided the course of progress. But a single tablet could shatter that narrative entirely. The inscriptions describe a people who mapped the heavens with precision, who constructed cities aligned with celestial cycles, and who understood energy, sound, and geometry in ways that rival modern science. They had a system of learning, wisdom, and governance that operated independently of priestly mediation. To the Church, such a revelation is more than inconvenient. It threatens a monopoly on spiritual authority that has lasted millennia. For if humans could once access the divine field directly, then salvation, enlightenment, and cosmic understanding are not granted by intermediaries. They are inherent potentials that have been deliberately hidden. The appearance of even one tablet would trigger a cascade of questions. How much knowledge was suppressed? Which other artifacts remain locked away? Could humanity reclaim the understanding that was once theirs? Scholars would rush to study the tablet, cross-reference it with Babylonian records, Gnostic texts, and hidden Mesopotamian archives. Academic circles would be forced to confront evidence that contradicts established chronologies and orthodox interpretations. The narrative of primitive pagans needing revealed truth would collapse. Historians, theologians, and the general public would be confronted with a past where humans were creators, engineers, and astronomers, not merely recipients of divine instruction. Beyond the academic implications, the impact on culture and society would be profound. Religions that base authority on exclusive knowledge would be destabilized. Faith communities might be forced to reconcile the fact that wisdom and morality do not require sanctioned intermediaries. Humanity's sense of self would shift from one of obedience to one of capability. The potential of what could be learned from the tablet is staggering. Instructions for aligning cities with the stars, resonance chambers that amplify consciousness, and techniques for harmonizing with natural cycles all point to a civilization that was self-empowered, technologically sophisticated, and spiritually aware. If Babylon speaks again, the door to rediscovery swings wide. Humanity may finally remember what was lost, not through scripture, not through miracles, but through evidence of the ingenuity, awareness, and mastery that once existed. The Vatican and other custodians of hidden knowledge would face a choice: continue to suppress or release and allow a collective awakening. One tablet, fully revealed, could change how every person understands the universe, history, and themselves. It would prove that the past was not as linear, simple, or dependent as we have been taught. It would remind the world that knowledge is not given, it is remembered, and that humanity's potential has always been far greater than the story we were told. By the time we reach the end of this journey beneath Babylon, through tunnels, tablets, and secret vaults, the story no longer belongs solely to archaeologists, scholars, or priests. It belongs to you, the one who listens, reads, and questions. If history has been edited from the ruins of Babylon to the archives beneath the Vatican, then the most radical act you can perform is not rebellion, not destruction, but simply asking questions. Every time you pause and wonder, Every time you refuse to accept the curated version of origins, you are participating in an invisible resistance. The sealed ground beneath civilizations has cracks. Through these fissures, fragments of truth leak, whispered to those willing to notice. The clay tablets, the star maps, the diagrams of resonance chambers, and the writings of the first priest kings were hidden to control thought, to shape obedience, and to maintain authority. But their concealment cannot erase what they contain. The knowledge encoded in these fragments still exists, and every question you ask nudges the boundaries of secrecy. Staying awake is more than a metaphor. It is a commitment to awareness, to refusing the comfortable story of primitive pagans, lost knowledge, and divine monopoly. It is the act of seeing that every truth presented to you may be filtered, delayed, or selectively revealed. Your place in this buried story is active, not passive. You are part of the chain that either maintains silence or allows light to return to shadowed knowledge. Each inquiry, each search for hidden connections, builds a bridge across centuries, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the vaults of Rome. The act of remembering, of seeking, is itself revolutionary. The fragments in secret archives and the erased tunnels beneath Babylon are reminders that humanity has always been capable of understanding, aligning with the cosmos, and achieving mastery beyond the claims of any single institution. You are not separate from that potential. Every time you question authority, study forbidden texts, or examine anomalies in history, you are reconnecting with a lineage of curiosity that was almost erased. History is not fixed. It is not a closed book. It is a flowing narrative, influenced by what is remembered and what is suppressed. By keeping your mind open and refusing to accept a single, curated story, you become part of the movement that allows history to breathe freely. The world around you may insist on simplicity, on narratives that are easy to teach and easy to believe. But beneath that simplicity, the complexity of truth waits. The cracks grow wider with each act of inquiry. You are standing at the edge of one of these fissures, looking down into millennia of concealed knowledge, and the choice is yours. Will you turn away, satisfied with the version offered to you, or will you lean closer, listen, and seek what has been hidden? Your attention, your questions, and your curiosity are the tools that keep the story alive. Even in the face of silence, even under the weight of centuries of curated memory, asking questions becomes an act of courage. The sealed ground may shift, the cracks may widen, and perhaps one day, what has been hidden will be remembered. Until then, your place in the buried story is to stay awake, to keep asking, and to never accept that what you are told is the full measure of human history.